You have two kinds of Muslims who will deny it. One, you have Muslims who know it's true, but who will deny it because they don't think you know any better. They think you just heard this from somewhere. You heard this from some person. And so, no, of course, Muhammad didn't have sex with a 9-year-old girl. That's just a myth spread by Islamophobes. No, it's not. There are, I think, a little over 200 sources in the Muslim sources about Muhammad having sex with a 9-year-old girl. It's all over their sources. If we don't know that about Muhammad, we don't know anything about Muhammad, because that's as good as it gets in Islam. You've got 200 sources all saying, over 200 sources all saying the same thing.
I was walking a particular path kind of on my way to the Temple Mount. Day after day, I was there for 3 weeks, and I would see these two guys off to the side there. It was like a little outpost of the main mosque there, and they would always say, come in, let's talk, have a Quran. They're very, evangelical in that sense. I was with my wife. She's like, we shouldn't do this. We have to get to other places, whatever. But finally, I had 5 days at the end of the trip when she wasn't there. And I was like, I'm going back there. I want to talk to these guys. So I went there. I sat down with them, talked with them for multiple hours, multiple days, and really just sought to understand their religion, their worldview. It was fascinating. In the middle of that conversation, a ton of different things came up. So I'm talking to them, and I am at night reading the Quran, and I come across a few different verses that, to me, reading this with Western eyes, appear to pretty explicitly state that some version of pedophilia is acceptable.
That's true.
And so I go to these guys and I say...
So you read, let me guess, you read Surah 65, verse 4 of the Quran.
I did. And then I did a bit of research and came across that fact that the life of Muhammad itself is a reflection of this teaching, and also that there is a belief with, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but that there's a belief that the life of Muhammad itself is exemplary to the point of perfectionistic, or
that is also in the Quran, Surah 33, verse 21 of the Quran, that Muhammad is a beautiful pattern of conduct.
So you have these two pieces working together where you see it there and then you see it reflected in the life of Muhammad. So I asked these guys that. I basically say, hey, I mean, and by the way, these guys were super hospitable. I really enjoyed talking to them. One of them was more combative. The other one was a more of a schmoozer, but I really liked both of them. I wasn't there trying to even like win a debate or something, because I know that I'm not the expert on this. So I was really trying to just be journalistic and to understand their perspective on these things. But I brought this to them, and they basically said that a few things. The first one is that adulthood is determined by, for a woman, her having her period.
That's a problem for them. So one, you have the idea that adulthood is defined by a girl getting her first period. From a medical perspective, that's ridiculous, because puberty is a process that actually takes a few years. It's not just you got your first period. It's now your hips start to widen and your breasts develop and your birth canal widens, and you become, over a period of a few years, ready to have a child. Lots of the guys in Islam who defend this have what you might call, I call it an old enough to bleed, old enough to breed mentality, where at the moment they see puberty, they can jump on there, and that leads to all sorts of medical problems. It's been documented for a long time in the medical field that you have all sorts of problems because, guess what? A girl who has reached puberty, hasn't completed it because it's a process. A girl has first reached puberty, yes, she might get pregnant. If her hips haven't widened and her birth canal hasn't widened, you're going to get some serious medical problems from that. And so infant mortality, mother mortality, all these go up when you think it's okay to have sex with a girl as soon as she's reached her first period. So that's one problem. The other massive problem here is that's not actually what the Muslim sources say. Those are later rulings from schools of Islamic jurisprudence. So some people study Islam from that perspective, from the perspective of later legal rulings and so on. You don't get that anywhere from the Muslim sources. Surah 65, verse 4 specifically refers to marrying, having sex with, and divorcing a girl all before she's ever reached puberty. So prepubescent. Aisha was prepubescent when Muhammad had sex with her. She was 9 years old. Muslims will assume that she was pubescent, like as if that's what Muhammad was waiting for when he waited until she was 9 years old. But the Muslim sources repeatedly refer to Aisha playing with her dolls when she was with Muhammad. And why that's relevant is the Muslim commentators say playing with dolls were considered an image, and images are forbidden in Islam. That's why you can't have pictures on the wall, you can't have dolls, and so on. So when they read Aisha was playing with dolls, it's like the Islamic way of saying she was still prepubescent, because until you reached puberty, you were not considered morally obligated to honor this rule about dolls. So in other words, you were allowed to play with dolls until you reached puberty. After that, you were considered an adult, and all images had to stop. So these passages about Aisha playing with dolls for years when she was with Muhammad, the Muslim commentators read, and the greatest Muslim commentators read that, and they say she was prepubescent, because at puberty she would have had to get rid of all that stuff. And so the Quran allows you to have sex with prepubescent girls, so you do not have to wait for a period. In fact, there's a famous video from Muhammad Hijab. You can check it out. I'll send it to you if you want. Where Muhammad Hijab, so he's one of the most popular da'is on the planet. He says that if you just go with what the Quran says, you would say that you can have sex with a 5-year-old. It wouldn't matter. Daniel Haqiqat, well, actually, there's a third problem here. So you've got the fact that that the Quran allows sex with prepubescent girls, and Muhammad had sex with a prepubescent girl, and that even the later Islamic rulings that as long as a girl gets her first period, that's okay. That's not what the Muslim sources say, but that's what their legal authorities decided. But even that is problematic, because puberty is a process. You should be waiting until she finishes puberty before you get into this. But even apart from all of those kinds of issues, you've got this problem. Muhammad Hijab saying that you could have sex with a girl even if she's only 5, and you have nowhere in the Muslim sources where you could actually get around that. But even people like Daniel Haqiqatjou and so on, who he's another famous Muslim da'i, he leads into the bigger problem that he goes with the Islamic jurists, the later Islamic jurists, which say as soon as a girl has some sort of signs of puberty, you can have sex with her. There's this thing called precocious puberty, where a girl gets puberty early, right? There's some sort of problem and a girl gets puberty early. He was asked in a debate on whether child marriage is morally acceptable. He was asked, what if a girl's 5 and she gets precocious puberty? And Daniel thought that it would be fine as long as you get parental consent. And the Inspiring Philosophy, Mike Jones, he kept asking, said, what if a girl gets precocious puberty at 4? What about 3? And then Daniel said, oh, that's impossible. And Inspiring Philosophy pointed out that there are examples of a girl getting precocious puberty as a baby, 11 months old. A girl went through puberty. What do you do then? And Daniel had no response. He's like, well, I don't think the parents would agree to that. But other than that, other than getting the parents to agree with it, he had no problem with the idea, because he's viewing it as, well, if that's the Islamic ruling, you wait till a girl has signs of puberty and then you can have sex with her. Okay, what do you do with when an 11-month-old baby has precocious puberty? And he couldn't rule against that. And keep in mind, as morally reprehensible as that is, he was at least waiting for puberty, and the Quran doesn't even require that. And Muhammad didn't even require that. So this is, I don't know. It's on the one hand, we want to be nice and we don't want to be mean. But on the other hand, it's like you're talking about sex with 4, 5, and 6-year-old girls. And that is as morally reprehensible as pretty much anything I can think of.
Well, that's the thing, is when I was talking to these guys, I was interested in understanding the Islamic way of salvation, or whatever their version of that is. And I thought we were going to have a conversation more about that. And then as I'm reading the Quran, I'm seeing these verses, I'm digging into this a little bit. And it's just something that is so, to be honest with you, I mean, it's hard for me even to make degrees of evil between 11 months old and 5 years old, and to me it's all completely insane and completely obviously disgusting and evil. And so, but what was interesting is when I then posted this video, because I have these guys on the record, because the last day I said, you guys, this is an amazing conversation. Can I bring my camera guy and can we like, I'm not even going to be debating. I'm just going to ask you, and I want you to speak for yourselves. I don't want it to be someone else speaking for you. And I want to hear you guys for yourselves communicate what you believe. And so I have this on camera. I posted this on YouTube of them saying exactly what we're talking about here. And what was interesting is the response that I got was either people, I mean, a mountain of whataboutisms, first of all. What about in the Bible when Mary and Joseph, and in the Old Testament when da da da. So I want to give you the opportunity to kind of speak into these whataboutisms where people kind of try to say, this is really what I think it distills down to, and tell me if I'm not doing a good job at the distillation here. But I think it distills down to, one, that's an old book. Everyone was crazy back in the day. So were Christians, so were Jews. Don't try to take the moral high ground. If this is bad, you guys are all in this bad together. And then two, some version of the weird science trying to actually scientifically moralize it, which is kind of what we already talked about. And then three, just like, oh no, you're not reading it right. You don't really understand what it's saying. It's not really saying that Muhammad was great, da da da. And it's just like basically just not being willing to like face it. So what would your response? Well, first of all, what do you think are the big ways that people try to get around this, or to kind of like justify this, moralize this, do the kind of whataboutism thing and talk about, Abraham or David or what? I don't know. People bring up all these things in the comments.
I can tell you exactly what they bring up.
Yep.
Because I've seen it 1,000 times, thousands of times. But yeah, if you follow this issue, you will have Muslims who deny it, right? And they'll especially do that. I mean, you have two kinds of Muslims who will deny it. One, you have Muslims who know it's true, but who will deny it because they don't think you know any better. They think you just heard this from somewhere. You heard this from some person. And so no, of course, Muhammad didn't have sex with a 9-year-old girl. That's just a myth spread by Islamophobes. No, it's not. There are I think, a little over 200 sources in the Muslim sources about Muhammad having sex with a 9-year-old girl. It's all over their sources. If put it this way, if we don't know that about Muhammad, we don't know anything about Muhammad, because that's as good as it gets in Islam. You've got 200 sources all saying, over 200 sources all saying the same thing. And even if you didn't have that, you'd still have the Quran saying it's okay to marry, have sex with, and divorce a girl all before she's ever reached puberty. So you will have people who know that it's true, but they'll deny it because they're just basically lying about Muhammad to avoid embarrassment. But you will also have Muslims who they've never read their sources. And so they've heard from someone, oh, Aisha was actually much older. She was probably 18, maybe in that one source that says she was not. Again, it's 200, not one. But they've heard, in other words, they've heard from the liars. And they've absorbed from the liars that maybe, when it says 9, maybe that was 19 and a 1 dropped off. And so they'll actually, I'm dead serious, they actually argue things like that. So the 1 dropped off in hundreds of sources. So you'll have things like that. And then once you are interacting with someone who is going to acknowledge the truth, yes, they'll appeal to moral relativism. They'll say, but it was a different time and a different culture. And there is this problem of what's called presentism, that we're judging the past by the standards of the present, even though 200 years, they'll be judging us by the standards of the future and so on. So you do have that. You have to be careful about applying rules to people who came a long time ago. And generally we would think, okay, well, if you grew up in an environment where that was normal, then we could give you a little leeway. Even if we really believe that what you're doing was objectively morally wrong, we could say, okay, if you grew up in an environment where that was normal and you didn't know any better, okay, well, we're not going to condemn you in the same way as someone who knew that it was wrong. The reason that doesn't really work in Islam is, we've already talked about it, Muhammad is the pattern of conduct. Muhammad's the pattern of conduct. So he is not supposed to be living according to the morality of his time, and that this morality is changing. He's the standard. He's laid down as the standard. So if he had sex with a 9-year-old girl, that is Allah putting his stamp of approval on that, because the guy, he says, if you want to live like someone, live like this guy. That's what he did. So that's a problem with that route. But as you've pointed out, the other main route they go with here, and they can do this in one of two ways. They can say, but in the Bible, or they can say, they point to different people down through history. Like Tristan Tate was recently defending child marriage, and he said, but when Princess Isabella married the king so-and-so, she was only 6 years old. And he gives a Wikipedia link and says, look, see right there, she was 6 years old. He obviously didn't read it, because you go down and it says, because she was only 6, the marriage was never consummated. Canon law, so church law, would not allow sex before a girl reached the age of 12. And so the marriage was never consummated, because he died before they ever consummated it. It says it consummated the marriage, and it says because it was a politically arranged marriage, the families arranged it for political purposes. He basically treated her like a daughter, and they never consummated the marriage. And so it's like, that's not a good example for you defending child marriage, when that's not what we're talking about with Muhammad at all. So they will go that route of pointing out, but look at these different people in history who've done this. How can you condemn it? Which is insane from an Islamic perspective. I mean, Islam doesn't believe in drinking alcohol. Imagine they said that and you said, but look at all the people down through history who drank alcohol. They'd think that's irrelevant. So we don't care. We don't care what other people did. We're saying that it's wrong. So that's one problem. But in the Bible, what's amazing, they just flat out lie. I don't mean all the Muslims who are saying it lie. Their leaders, they're da'is. So their da'is are the ones who are inviting people to Islam, but these are their apologists and so on. They just flat out lie. So they'll say things like, and what's crazy is Christians assume that they're telling the truth, and they've done this research. And people will assume. So they will say, but Mary was 12 years old and Joseph was 90. So if you're condemning child marriage, what do you say? What do you say to that? And that's such a ridiculous response. One, it wouldn't matter what Joseph is not a pattern of conduct in Christianity. Joseph, we could find an ancient document right now that says Joseph was an axe murderer. It wouldn't affect Christianity. He's not a source of Christian doctrine or practice. So any of these situations is going to be different from the situation with Muhammad. But two, where are you getting the idea that Mary was 12 from and that Joseph was 90? You familiar with the chapter? Let me quiz you here. Chapter and verse. What says that Mary was any age, and what says that Joseph was any age?
It's funny because I have also never read that, but you're right that when someone gives you a comment that is specific, you assume it's rooted in something that is real.
Yeah, and so it's interesting. When you see someone saying, Mary could have been 12, they're basing that on the fact that rabbis wouldn't allow marriage before the age of 12. And so it's just that's when she could have gotten married according to the law at the time, according to the rabbis of the time. That doesn't, as far as the sources are concerned, she could have been 20, right? All you have to go on from a biblical perspective is that she's called a woman. Blessed are you among women. And in the Bible, girls up to the age of 12 were still called little girls, right? When Jesus says to the little girl, arise, it says she was 12 years old. So girls up to the age of 12 were called little girls. It would be sometime after that when you were considered an adult, but that's all you have to go on. Mary's called a woman in a book where anyone up to 12 is still called little girl. Other than that, you have no ground to go on. So to treat that as a parallel to what we're dealing with in Islam, where we have, again, 200 plus sources saying that Aisha was 9 years old, where in the world are you getting the claim that Mary was 12? Well, here's what's actually disturbing, very disturbing. Their top apologists who deal with this will say, they'll give this quote. They'll say, according to the Catholic Encyclopedia, Mary was 12. According to the Catholic Encyclopedia, Mary was 12. And it's just a rule. This is the only group, and I'm not talking about Muslims in general. You might meet a Muslim, he might be the most honest person in the world. They're da'is, so they're people who do apologetics. I've never seen people more dishonest in my life. And that's why you have to be careful. If I'm talking to a Jew and I ask about Judaism, I'm assuming that the Jew is telling me what he really believes about Judaism. If I'm talking to a Hindu and I'm asking about Hinduism, hey, what's Diwali? Could you explain that to me? I'm not going to, I have to verify everything this person says, because I'm assuming this person's telling the truth. Almost any group out there, if you're asking someone who's remotely knowledgeable, saying, hey, what is this? You assume they're giving you the truth. With these Dawa guys, do not listen to anything they say without saying, I want to read that for myself. Because what they do, they'll say the Catholic Encyclopedia says Mary was 12, and they'll even circulate a quotation from the Catholic Encyclopedia. If you actually go, and this is why you have to go to the sources, if you actually go to the place where that occurs in the Catholic Encyclopedia, it's on an article on the age of Joseph, right before it, they cut off the sentences which say there are apocryphal sources which can't be trusted because they're later and because they were written with an agenda. And then right after it, it calls them fantasies that can't be trusted and can't be taken seriously and go and defy all rules of probability. So they basically say, hey, there were some later, and the reason they had the later sources was people kept objecting to the Catholic idea that Mary was a perpetual virgin. And so they're bringing up, well, so she had Jesus. Why would she be a virgin forever? Why wouldn't Joseph have sex with her? And then later centuries came up with the idea, because she was really young and Joseph was a 90-year-old man. He was too old. He wasn't interested in sex anymore. And he was just taking care of her as he would take care of a daughter. And that's why they never had sex. So notice the problem. Even if you wanted to go with these sources from centuries later, there was never any sex. There was never any sex. How is this a parallel to Muhammad having sex with a 9-year-old girl? But two, these are later sources. The Catholic Encyclopedia says you can't trust these or build anything off of these. They're just reporting what's in these later sources. They say you can't trust them, but their apologists will say, according to the Catholic Encyclopedia, she was 12. When the Catholic Encyclopedia is saying you can't know how old she was and you can't trust the later sources because they had an agenda. So that's the type of people you're dealing with. The other main one that you'll get is they'll say that Isaac married Rebecca when she was a 3-year-old. And it's the most insane position. All you read about Rebecca is, Abraham sends his servant to find a bride for Isaac, and she comes out carrying the water jar, and then she waters all his camels for him, and takes care of him. And I have a 5-year-old.
What a stud.
Yeah, it's like, okay, she would have to be like baby She-Hulk to be doing this. Because these camp, you're talking about like hundreds of gallons of water that this little 3-year-old who's having this conversation and who's out in the field working, she's doing all this. You can't get that number from anything in there. There's no indication. But since it doesn't say, they feel like they can say whatever they want, right? Since it doesn't say her age.
Is it like 3 is just as good as 4, or like why would they say 3?
There is an insane argument, which they stopped using, so now they just say it. But before they actually had an argument, because at the end of Genesis 22, it says Abraham heard from his relatives. It says Abraham heard from his relatives about all the children who'd been born to his family. And she's on that list. And so what they do is they calculate it from right then. They say, here's how old everyone is right when this happened. So that's when she was born. It's like, what are you talking about? He's hearing news from home. He hasn't heard news from home in decades. He hears about all the family members. And so they calculate it right from there. And they say, since that's when he heard about this, that must be when she's been born. When it lists a ton of relatives that he found out were born to his family. And it's like, do you think all this long list of names, all these people were born right that second, right when like you got an email about it? You're talking about hundreds of miles away. And he finally gets news from home. Her name is on the list of the people who've been born to his family. And they say, so that's when she's born. We'll calculate it from then. And it's like, really? You think all these people were born right then when he finally hears news from home? So they will try to argue for it. They don't even usually make that argument anymore because it's so ridiculous. But now they just cling to the claim that she was 3 years old. And they'll like, I was just dealing with this early this morning with a Muslim who was saying, she was 3 or 4. And I said, prove your point, chapter and verse, give me the case right now. And the response was, in Genesis 23, it says that Rebecca died when she was 100. I mean, it says that Sarah died when she was 137, and that Rebecca was born at that time. And I go, what? Rebecca's not even mentioned in that chapter. Where are you getting that from? And so that's the case. I actually named this. I called it Islam's 99-1 rule. that it's just built into them as part of dawah that if you're talking to 100 people, maybe one of them is going to go look up what you say. The 99 are not. They're just, oh, wow. Especially if they're on your side, they're going to believe whatever you say. But even people who aren't on your side, if you just say it like you know what you're talking about, they're going to think you know what you're talking about. And if you say, oh, yeah, in Genesis 23, it says this, they'll just, oh, wow, I don't have Genesis 23 memorized. So I'll just assume this person is telling the truth. And so it's like they believe that if you just keep going out and 99% of people are going to believe you, and very small, very tiny group of people are going to check what you say, and the overwhelming majority who don't check it can always shout down the other person.
Right.
They just believe that you keep winning like that. You can keep spreading nonsense like that. And so that's why they actually seem to think it's okay to spread complete lies. But this happens over and over again. They do this with the Bible. And it's amazing because they claim to respect prophets. They claim to respect Mary. They claim to respect Jesus. And they will not hesitate to make things up. Again, I'm not talking about all Muslims. I'm talking about their leaders of dawah and apologetics. Again, I've never seen anyone who was this quick to lie, especially about people they claim to respect.